Thank you very much, everyone, again for being here and for joining on time to this interesting webinar that the MEXCHAM has put in place. The MEXCHAM Hong Kong has put in place about China's digital yuan and the opportunities that this brings to the Mexican community, to the Hong Kong community, and also to the greater Bay Area. We're going to discuss about this digital currency across the following hour. Again, please feel free to drop in your questions. At the bottom of the Zoom window, you will find the Q&A section. Type in the questions that you would like to share with us. We would be more than happy, or the panelists would be more than happy to address them. So just a brief introduction into the amazing panelist and the leader of this conversation that we will have today. First, I would like to introduce Carolina Romero, who will be leading this interaction. Carolina holds a graduate degree in international finance. She is currently Chief Financial Officer for Commercial Banking in Asia Pacific for HSBC. We also have today as one of the panelists, Musheer Ahmed. He is an MBA alumni for the University of Hong Kong, and he is the founder and managing director of FinStep Asia, a fintech and digital ecosystem advisory. Musheer is also the co-founder of the Fintech Association in Hong Kong and startup ambassador for the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. We also have today Oriol Caudevilla. He is a management consultant in data analysis and international strategy for AirHelp, the largest consumer legal tech company. He's also a fellow at the Digital Euro Association, and he is an active fintech advisor. Oriol is also an honorary fellow at the Asian Institute of International Financial Law at HKU. So just a very brief commercial that it's important for me to say. This is organized by the Mexican Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. Feel free to drop into our website. We're more than happy to grow this network with you. As you will be seeing, we are organizing different events and different webinars throughout the year. So join the community, join the Mexican community here in Hong Kong, as we are trying to build bridges between Mexico, Hong Kong, and the greater Bay Area. So more than happy to see you here in the webinar. So thank you very much for joining. And without further ado, I would leave the stage to Carolina, who will be presenting or asking the first questions regarding the Chinese digital yuan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our great panelists. It's a pleasure for me to be here leading this conversation. I'm sure all of us are gonna learn a lot. And it's a really interesting topic. Really new, as we were discussing right before this chat, that requires us to stay on top of the topic, new things coming out every day, news, and it's sort of also a bit of a unexplored territory for some of us. So I think having the opportunity to hear from you guys that have a vast experience and that know the market, and most importantly, that have the vision to understand how does that impact corporates, individuals, and different members of society across countries, it's going to be a really great opportunity for our attendees to understand how to make the most out of it and what opportunities this whole digital currency presents for us. So without further ado, I think it's good if we start with a very simple, but probably good to set the scene for all of us to understand the next part of the conversation. What is a central bank digital currency, and how does it differentiate from a cryptocurrency? Sorry, please, Oriol, should we start with you? Or Musheer, sorry.
Sure. Sure, I can start myself if you want. Well, so basically, a central bank digital currency, also known as a CBDC, is basically a new form of central bank money. So, I mean, it would be like the same idea of the central bank money that we already have, like, for example, the euro, the yuan, the US dollar, but in a digital form. Being digital, though, makes it different in the sense that it's going to be, for example, programmable. So it's not just about making the central bank money that we already have digital. It's much more than that, no? Because by becoming digital, it's going to become what we call a programmable money, which is going to allow, well, central banks to add or remove certain features from them. So that's pretty much the idea of central bank digital currencies. I mean, they need to be digital, and they are central bank money. Therefore, they are a liability against a central bank. I think that's like a very short summary. I'm sure that Musheer is going to add many more things to this. But I think that's like a quick summary. And regarding the difference with cryptocurrencies, well, I mean, cryptocurrencies are, generally speaking, could be defined as digital currencies secured by cryptography and normally blockchain based. That would be like a broad definition of cryptocurrencies. I think the key point in here that we're going, I'm sure, to dig deep on that later, but just as an introduction, CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. It's very common for most people to think, because it's common to think that CBDCs are cryptocurrencies or are the same or similar. It's common because actually when you go to the media, it's very usual to find the media referring to for example, China's digital yuan as China's cryptocurrency or something like that. But the thing is, CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. This is so, I mean, there are several differences between them, but just as a summary, I would say that CBDCs have a different rationale behind when compared to cryptocurrencies. As I said before, CBDCs are central bank money, whereas cryptocurrencies are something different. I mean, they can be used, of course, to make and receive payments, but to me, so far, its largest use maybe has been that of being like an investment asset class. So there's a completely different rationale behind them. CBDCs are per se, and I'm sure that Musheer will add many more ideas to that, but summarizing, CBDCs are centralized because they are issued by a central bank, controlled by a central bank, whereas cryptocurrencies are actually the flagship of this movement known as DeFi, decentralized finance, meaning that the main rationale, the main idea behind cryptocurrencies is precisely not to be controlled. I mean, that's why they are like part of this DeFi movement, while CBDCs are actually in that sense the opposite. So I would say that the main two differences, I mean, there are many more, but the main two are the different rationale and the different purpose between them.
I completely agree. I think Oriol's done a great job summarizing both those points, right? And the key thing to keep in mind is one is the technologies in a variety of digital currencies can be very different. What we're looking with central bank digital currencies is effectively use of distributed ledger technologies to make their currencies, which in a lot of forms can already be operational digitally on the distributed ledger technology platform, right? Which comes with a host of advantages, which we can talk about later. While on the other side, when you're comparing with cryptocurrencies, as Oriol mentioned, one is centralization versus decentralization is a major element. Most cryptocurrencies, if not 95% of them, are decentralized in the way they are issued and minted and etc. Whereas in case of central bank digital currencies, it's the central bank controlling it. There are other implications as well. With cryptocurrencies, they effectively operate in their own ecosystem. So think of it like if you were in, and it's a crude example, but maybe pertinent. Say you were in Macau and you were in a casino. If you went to MGM, you could only use that token that MGM gives you in that ecosystem, right? You can't go to Venetian and use it in some senses. It's a very limited use, and that's what most cryptocurrencies are. I'm not equating them to gambling, but I'm just saying they operate within their own ecosystem and they are being used for various applications. So for example, when you're looking at Ether that's being used or Ethereum as a blockchain underneath, it's being used on the Ethereum blockchain for transactions that take place there. You could also hold it as an asset, but the primary purpose is that. While for central bank digital currencies, this is effectively the the distributed ledger technology for their existing currencies. It does not change in value or function per se, but it brings in a lot more control when it comes to monetary policy, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, as you said, there are a few other things that we will deep dive around the efficiency, the benefits that this brings. But I think before going into these questions, probably it's good that we start with the topic that brings us together here around the yuan, and what is the digital yuan? Why is it important for us today here? And I think another aspect to think about is, why is it important for the connectivity of China into the world financial markets? How does it play, or which role does it play into this connectivity? Should we start this time with Musheer?
Thanks. I think it's an answer that could take hours, or it could be answered in a couple of sentences, because it's not necessarily a loaded question, but it's got a lot of layers to it, right? For us to understand and what we're looking to do. Maybe one more thing that we haven't, and I'm just taking a step back, is to talk about two aspects of CBDCs, right? There are two main broadly types of CBDCs, and there's a third type, but largely you're talking about what are known as retail CBDCs, and then you're talking about wholesale CBDCs, right? Effectively the same in terms of value of the currency, but in terms of the applications, they're different. So wholesale CBDCs are largely used for business transactions between different businesses or between economies, etc., when they're large scale purchases taking place, while retail CBDC is for the end consumer usage in mainland China, right? Largely. Now, what is the digital yuan? As we mentioned, it's a digital representation of the yuan on a decentralized on a distributed ledger technology platform, or a blockchain to a certain extent, depending on what they use as a layer. And it is effectively moving to a stage where the technology of decentralization comes with a lot of advantages that a central bank can leverage off, right? Currently, in terms of when cash is issued, there is a certain amount of overview or control, like money supply, etc., that central banks can do with interest rate, but the time it takes to peter down can be 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months before it has a proper impact on the economy. While with CBDCs, you could effectively, as a central bank, be able to track, and I'm not saying necessarily looking at the privacy options, but be able to track all the transactions that are taking place. You could use what are known as smart contracts on the blockchain technology, which effectively is a set of programs or commands that could be executed. For example, you could do tax at source, right? So in places like where there is sales tax, or general sales tax or VAT in certain countries, you could then effectively deduct that at source. Then again, with inflation as well, you will exactly know where there is high demand, where there is low demand, so you could vary that. You could effectively also function when it comes to retail, also look to ease the difficulties that there is with financial inclusion, right? A lot of people struggle with getting bank accounts or other aspects. So in case of central bank digital currencies, you don't technically need an intermediary and a commercial bank, right? I think that's one other element to emphasize. In the current model system that exists in the banking world, you have correspondent banks and intermediary banks, right? So central banks will mint the money, and then they pass it on to the banks, and then that's the distribution channel, right? And that was needed because that's how the operation has been for physical cash. What with digital and with CBDCs, you don't really need to do that. Technically, an individual or a business could have a bank account with the central bank directly, right? And that could be managed directly in terms of any transactions that are taking place. Now, whether central banks go for that model or not is a decision that they can take, and that's still being debated. However, but that's a possibility that you have with CBDCs, which you did not have previously. I will stop on that point, and I'll just quickly touch upon the second half of the question on the impact on economy, etc. Now, when you are looking at CBDCs, as I mentioned, there's wholesale and then there is retail. The third part of looking at it is with regards to what happens when it's cross-border, right? typically in today's world, a lot of the cross-border transactions are very expensive, but they also involve an intermediary currency or intermediary value that you have to attach when you're converting, right? Yes, when I'm doing because in like the Indian rupee is not fully convertible, as is the Chinese renminbi, right? It's not fully convertible against any currency. So a lot of times there is a dependency on the US dollar or the euro, which are the two largest currencies in circulation, and as well as the GBP. So in this case, technically what could happen is you could function without having to link anything with the dollar exchange. There doesn't need to be any dollar access. You just need a reference rate, and you can then technically just swap those currencies in cross-border, which is happening in terms of a trial for that in the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. Their innovation node in Hong Kong is working with PBOC, the Central Bank of UAE, Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and Bank of Thailand, all central banks, on multi-CBDC platform to effectively experiment and trial out how this mechanism can work between 4 different currencies, which are effectively independent of each other. I'm sure Oriol will have a lot more to add and quite more depth as well. So over to you, Oriol.
Thank you. No, I mean, thank you for your thorough analysis. I actually agree with all your remarks and your points. Well, basically, just to try to add something. I mean, basically, you asked me, Carolina, first of all, what's digital yuan, and secondly, what does it mean for the integration of China into the world of financial market? When it comes to the first part, I would pretty much say what Musheer said. No, I mean, digital yuan is China's central bank digital currency, China's CBDC. It's not a reality yet, in the sense that it's not actually been like massively deployed yet. I mean, it's going to be rolled out next year, theoretically, by the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing in 2022. So so far it's been tested since April and May last year. And actually, those tests, which started last year, came after more than 6 years of research. So as we can see, deploying a CBDC is something that takes time. I mean, no country is going to be capable of like deciding to go for a CBDC and deploying it like overnight. No, I mean, it takes a while because there are many implications involved. I mean, Musheer mentioned before, and this is very true, that CBDCs can be used for promoting financial inclusion. They can be used as well for fighting financial crime, for monetary policy purposes, for also for trying to replace physical cash. I mean, there may be like several rationales behind CBDCs, and this is very true. But at the same time, CBDCs may pose a certain, I'm not going to say threats, but they may touch sensitive areas. I mean, a CBDC may affect a country's monetary policy. They may affect privacy. So I'm not saying in any way that CBDCs are a threat, but what I'm saying is that since they are like, they are touching sensitive areas, any country in the central bank needs to be sure before deploying it that CBDC actually works. I mean, architecture-wise, monetary policy-wise. So this is why it takes a few years. So whenever you may read on the media something like this or that country is going to have its CBDC, in most cases what it means is that this or that country is actually going to start like its tests. But it doesn't mean that in the end they are going to deploy it. In the case of China, yes, they are. I mean, I'm sure they will, but it doesn't apply to all the other cases. Then when it comes to the second part of the question, well, I mean, I think that China is, of course, already integrated in the global financial markets, but to me, based on what we've been seeing these last few months, there is no doubt that despite China's large unbanked population and despite all that, I think that China's main goal, or at least one of China's main goals when it comes to its digital yuan, is to try to internationalize to some extent its yuan. I mean, via the digital yuan. In other words, to try to convert some of the US dollar denominated transactions, international trade, into RMB denominated ones. But as Musheer said before, I mean, there are many things to consider here. I mean, the yuan is a non-convertible currency, so deploying a CBDC per se is not going to be enough. I mean, it's great to have like the right technology, for China to try to internationalize the yuan, but at the same time, the technology alone is not enough, in my opinion. I mean, it takes more than that, because I mean, currently the greenback, the US dollar, actually accounts for almost a 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. Whilst, for example, the RMB, if I'm not mistaken, accounts for, I think it's a bit less than 4%. So the difference is huge. Digital yuan may, in that sense, help China internationalize a bit its yuan. I mean, I don't doubt that. But to what extent, that's difficult to know right now. I mean, it's difficult because there are many things involved. So I don't think that the yuan is going like to overtake the US dollar like overnight. I'm not saying that, but it might have some influence. I mean, we saw China, for example, the People's Bank of China signing that joint venture with SWIFT in February in order to try to internationalize the yuan. We saw, for example, China starting to test digital yuan in Hong Kong, tests which are mostly like focused on cross-border payments. So we see an interest now in that area, but it doesn't mean though that things are like international trade and international like monetary policy are going like to change overnight. I mean, it takes time and there are many factors involved. And I think, well, that pretty much summarizes what I wanted to say for this second question. So
if I may just quickly add to what Oriol was saying, and I think it brings up a very, very important point around technology, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with blockchain and decentralized ledger technologies, the whole idea there is that there are many different protocols, in a sense, different rules and different technology in itself that exist, right? And you can do, so it's a bit like thinking, you can have Google Sheets, you can have Microsoft Excel, or let's take notes as an example, right? You can have Microsoft Word, you can have Mac Notebook, you can have, something else that you want to use, or Notion, etc. All of them do the same thing, that is take down, enable you to take notes and write a document, but they all are operating on different softwares, right? Albeit using a common software underneath, or there are these adapters or converters, or however you want to call that. So in a similar way, a lot of central banks aren't necessarily choosing the same like-for-like technology when it comes to CBDCs, right? They may be using different type of technologies, and integrating those technologies or interlinking those technologies can in itself be a massive challenge, right? And so if you think globally in the 60s and 70s, when SWIFT came about, it was the whole thing with SWIFT was standardization, right? And that's a very important element when we talk about central bank digital currencies. Is SWIFT brought in a standardization format, so all banks globally could transfer money in a standard format with standard details, and all agreed to accept it, right? SWIFT is, what is SWIFT? SWIFT is effectively formed together by a host of banks, right? It's an association of banks overall, which is independently operated as such. So in a similar way, for central banks, it will take time for these models, and that's where Oriol is very, very pertinent point on the time that will take for CBDCs to become universal. First, when you look at the roadmap of the other countries, China is definitely way ahead in terms of implementation among the major economies. There've been a couple of others like Bahamas, Sand Dollar, and a couple of others who may have gone live already. But among the major G20, China is leading far ahead. And secondly, for the others to go from start POCs, then go live, and then integrate, it's at least 3 to 5 years away. That process. And then we'll follow the process of acceptance and other uses as such. Just to add on top. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you put a very interesting point on the table, and I think maybe just if we can get your views around. You mentioned China is well ahead of the game versus other economies or markets, and we see that in many senses, China is ahead of the game when it comes to international payments, digitization, levels of banking penetration on the day-to-day activities. So, I mean, just to get your thoughts around what are sort of the key attributes that China has that gets them to be leading the game versus other markets? What is their advantage and how are they using it?
You're quite right in terms of digital adoption. China's way ahead of most countries, right? According to the EY FinTech Adoption Index, which is an indicator of amount of digital transactions or banking or etc. that people with a mobile phone do, right, smartphone do. China and India were tied at 87%. So, which is this is 2019, and I'm sure the number has gone up. But Oriol made a point earlier about the financial inclusion element and the number of people using mobile payments in China. It's about 900 million, possibly, because there's less than 900 million adults who have access to internet, and we're talking about a population of 1.4 billion. So there's still about 300-400 million people in mainland China who don't have necessarily and regular access to digital money. Having said that, the volumes of transactions on mobile payments is massive in China. The number was about 30 trillion US dollars last year, right, in 2020, and expected to grow to over $35 trillion this year. So that just means that in the urban part of China and among these 800 million to 900 million people, mobile payments and digital money is omnipresent, and it's just a way of life, right? For those of us who've been to China regularly, and when the rules came in where they made it that you had to tie your WeChat and Alipay to a bank account, local bank account, we struggled with cash, right? So much so that the PBOC had to bring in a rule and tell that you need to accept cash because there are a bunch of people who may have cash. Not to support foreigners necessarily, but that was something that happened. So it is very prevalent, and very few people are carrying cash. There's a research done about 3-4 years ago, asking people in mainland how comfortable you are without cash for a certain amount of time, right? So about 70% of them said that they could go without, with less than 100 renminbi in the wallet for over a week, right? And I think that number is probably much longer now, and I'm trying to do that in Hong Kong at times. But coming back to the point there being that not everybody, but that that 800-900 million people are used to digital money and digital payments. So that swap of in terms of using the digital renminbi is effectively another app or another system, right? That ties in from that overall system. So it's relatively a lot easier to execute for mainland China than it is for most other large economies. Certain economies like Sweden, where digital transactions are very high, they could probably have a similar impact, right? But other economies like the US, UK to a certain extent, and elsewhere, it will take some time. So that's point number one. Point number two is in terms of policy, they've been looking at it for a few years. This is not something that came up overnight last year or the year before, right? So they have been looking at it, they decided to invest into it and actively pursue it, right? As has been the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, right? So this is at least 4-5 years, 6 years of work. So this is showing fruit now. While when we look at some of the other central banks, they started research on this a year or 2 years ago. Someone like a Fed hasn't actively, officially running POCs on the so-called digital dollar, right? The POC or the research that's being done, it's being done by Accenture and a couple of other independent associations. So you do see that certain central banks are still reviewing where to go with this. So China's already, gone ahead with it. So they caught the wind probably much sooner than the others. So that's another in terms of an impact. And as Oriol mentioned, they are looking at a worldview. They're looking at a 5-10 year, 15-year view where they want to be ready. And technology is a key pillar of a Chinese policy, right? We've heard President Xi talk about artificial intelligence. A year, 2 years ago, he spoke about blockchain being an important element for the economy. So it is all but natural that you see technology and digital transformation and digital money being forefront for the central bank. And I'll stop there.
I agree with Musheer's points. I think it's basically because of two elements. I mean, digital adoption, as he just mentioned. I mean, people in China are much more cashless than people like pretty much anywhere else. I mean, if you compare China with, let's say, for example, Japan or most countries in the European Union or in the rest of the West, you see that people in China are already used to paying like without using cash, and even nowadays with WeChat Pay, Alipay, this kind of platforms. So that's always an advantage, when it comes to trying to deploy a CBDC. And aside from that, it's also what Musheer said. I mean, China started before, and I think that China has actually bet hard on the digital yuan. And it's quite interesting actually to see that most central banks working on CBDC projects, especially in the West, they are working on those projects as what we could call like backup plans. I mean, for example, if you check what the Bank of Canada wrote about CBDCs or most central banks in Europe, UK, US, what they think normally is something that, well, I mean, we're going to test our CBDCs now, and we might consider deploying our CBDC in the future should the use of cash decline, should, for example, privately issued cryptocurrencies become much more widely used and therefore pose a threat for our monetary stability. But it's like testing their CBDCs in case many things happen. I mean, there are many ifs involved. Whereas in the case of China, for example, they decided to test their digital yuan without so many ifs. I mean, their intention was like already to deploy it by the Winter Olympic Games next year, without like seeing many more conditions. That makes China's intentions much more clear in the sense that they want to actually deploy next year, whereas other countries want to test it, but they are not sure yet. So this is why China is ahead. And well, it's actually an opportunity as well for the other countries, because it's going to allow the rest of countries to see how a major economy handles a CBDC, because as Musheer mentioned before, other countries like the Bahamas already deployed their CBDCs, but we are talking about very small economies. So seeing such a big economy as China's one dealing with a CBDC may also be like an important learning tool for the rest of central banks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They're going big and testing it. And you mentioned around they're doing some well, let's call it test, or they're trying it in other markets for cross-border activities. I think you mentioned Hong Kong as being one of them. And obviously, as we're in Hong Kong, we're talking with people that are looking to leverage opportunities in Hong Kong. What's your view around entrepreneurs in Hong Kong in terms of what should they be thinking about in terms of the digital yuan, or how can they leverage it, or what sort of maybe even threats it's posing to the Hong Kong companies? Oriol, do you want to give us your views?
Sure. Well, basically, I don't think, I mean, I may be wrong, of course, and maybe Musheer has more ideas to add, but I feel like entrepreneurs and investors shouldn't be worried about digital yuan being deployed in China, because when it comes specifically to Hong Kong, the digital yuan doesn't aim to replace like the Hong Kong dollar to an extent or anything like that. So I feel like in that sense, I don't think that investors, entrepreneurs should be worried at all. I mean, digital yuan is going to become, if eventually deployed next year, it's going to become like one more tool for people in mainland China to make their payments. I mean, they're going to, as Musheer mentioned before, it's going to be a retail CBDC for the large public. So they're going to use it for making payments. But I don't think that generally speaking, like investors in Hong Kong should be worried or affected by that to any extent. At least this is what I think. It's true that in the case of Hong Kong, there are many more projects. Musheer mentioned before the CBDC bridge project, which is very interesting as well. But generally speaking, I mean, it's what we said before. CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. So that means as well that despite CBDCs being programmable money, despite allowing central banks to add or remove certain features from their CBDC, generally speaking, broadly speaking, they are nothing else but a digital version of the central bank money that we already have. So I don't think there are going to be a big change in that sense when it comes to investors needing to be worried about that or anything like that.
I completely agree, right? I mean, it's a question of, it's a system. So think of it like when people started accepting digital money instead of cash, did it mean that investors had to be worried about a certain country or a certain, about their business? It just means you're changing the way that you were transacting in terms of the nature, but the value of the currency, etc., does not really change that much. So in a similar way, the transfer from being physical cash to digital cash has taken decades in many countries and still very heavy in many others, right? So even in mainland China, even if the transition is there from there's still decent number of people who use cash. They first need to get to digital, so maybe they'll jump and get to digital renminbi first, or digital yuan as it were. And whereas the ones who are already using digital money, it will be a very small change at the back end, right? It's a bit like when we talk about blockchain being the underlying fabric of internet. For the end user, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to you what the iOS is, or what are the changes that are happening in the iOS versus Android. You really don't understand that. You just want to use WeChat, right? Or using WhatsApp. It's the same functionality in both 99% of the time. So I don't see it as an impact for and for Hong Kong entrepreneurs. Hong Kong is the world's largest offshore renminbi center, right? Over 70% of renminbi offshore is traded in Hong Kong globally, and Hong Kong is also the largest FDI investor or route for investment into mainland China. So it's a very important place, and I don't see that changing necessarily in what will happen. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about intermediaries going forward. But personally, for investors or for individuals or businessmen in Hong Kong or any other place, CBDCs don't really pose a threat. If anything, they may actually accelerate and help more in the future times to bring in more financing, bringing better rates for cross-border transactions.
That's great news. I think better rates is always what entrepreneurs want to hear. I guess following up on that question and talking a bit more about cross-border activity, and what does that mean? I guess one of the key items that we need to look at is foreign exchange. And how does that then change into this world of, you mentioned really well around convertible currencies and sort of what happens when you don't have to depend on those base. Well, of course, too soon to tell, as we said, the volume 4% versus 60% of the world reserves. So far from getting into a point where that's going to happen. But I think considering the pace of change and the exponential time acceleration that we're seeing on the back of all this technology, we might be talking about a few years from now, possibly decades, but it's not far off. So what's your view around foreign exchange, and how do we need to consider that from an investment perspective as well, and users and investment perspective? Musheer, you want to give us your view?
Sure. So when we're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of cross-border currencies and transactions in itself, it's a matter of one is we are likely to get better transaction rates, because if the central bank is facilitating that cross-border payment, then the fees are likely to be very minimal, right? And likely to be at cost if it is a central bank that's facilitating it. So when you look at the project Lion Rock, which HKMA has been running with the Bank of Thailand, or it's called Project Inathon on the other side, that's what they're trying to do, which is, for example, the HK, say I want to, as a Hong Kong entrepreneur, I need to do trades with a Thai entrepreneur, right? And let's assume Oriol is the Thai trader on the other side, and we're doing a transaction worth $1 million Hong Kong dollars, right? So instead of having to go and buy Thai baht or use my bank and they'll charge a high rate, I will go through the HKMA, who will issue me a token, right, for that equivalent amount. For, let's assume, 1 Hong Kong dollar is equal to 5 Thai baht, so 200,000 Thai baht. I use the digital token is then transferred to to Oriol. Oriol will take it and he'll go digitally to the Thai central bank, and they will exchange that for Thai baht, right? And then the central banks will swap on their own. Now, a lot of these transactions are done digitally and will happen in a matter of seconds because of program money, and that's what distributed ledger technology and smart contracts bring to the table, right? And that technology has to be tested and tried. And when you look at a multi-CBDC project, that becomes more complex, and that's what they're trying to solve, right? So that's a clear classic case of saving a lot of money. In a similar way, if somebody understands how remittance works in today's world, right? There's actually not so much money transfer that takes place cross-border. It's actually, there's a lot of netting that takes place locally in the same place. So there'll be a lot of people who are coming in and buying renminbi for Hong Kong dollars, and some who are exchanging Hong Kong dollars for renminbi, right? So then you have a net effect, so you don't have to really transfer every transaction, and then you just transfer the balance or the over amount that is there. So in the same way, that was being done by remittance players. Now you could have a central bank doing that. So I think that's an important element, though it is a few years away, 3 to 5 years away, to go fully operational for multiple currencies. I would imagine it can start possibly for 1:1 currencies in 3-4 years time at best, for wholesale, not retail. So that's going to be one advantage. The second is just going to be another element we need to be aware of is the technology, as we were talking about, right? Because there are different DLTs in place, then you have to have that intermediary layers that are able to function and be interoperable, right? So there's this concept of stable coins that comes into picture, or tokens, as we were speaking about, that would play a role. And so for me, these are two important elements for cross-border and how that would impact businessmen and as well as trades going forward. You will also then see that the need, you may start seeing 1:1 ratios being set by different central banks, right? What is one of the main reasons that people set the rates against the US dollar? It is the world's largest economy, right, by far, and number one trading partner for quite a huge number of countries, albeit that China is now close to being number 2 or number 1 for many of those countries. So when they are trading with that country, they need to use that currency of the country, and it's universally acceptable, right? So you end up then storing that currency with you. So when you have a storage of that currency, which is the US dollar, you tend to want to benchmark against that because you want to use that up, right? So it's more stable for you. There's less volatility and less risk of currency going away. Whereas when it comes to digital forms, you don't really need to store it and maybe value it. And if central banks may be more open to doing 1:1 valuation of currencies, and you could then implement sophisticated economic models, potentially through smart contracts for the value between currencies, which will be seen, and there could be a dynamic discovery. So that's why it's a little more complex and a little more further down the line than people imagine or are expecting suddenly that may turn around in 2 years. I would say what I'm talking about in terms of that circumstances are at least 7 to 10 years away for a dynamic 1:1 currency conversion to take place like a freehold in the future. Oriol?
Thank you very much. I think the banks needs to start worrying a little bit. That's not good for us. Oriol, sorry, do you have something to add?
Sure. No, I mean, basically, I agree with everything that Musheer just said about this topic. I also think that technology is like the key. No, I mean, once again, when it comes to CBDCs, it's mostly going to be all around technology. So the same when applied to Forex. I think as well that, as Musheer said, I mean, we still need like a few years now to see how everything is going to evolve. Because when it comes to this whole CBDC area, we are talking based on what we are seeing now and based on what we've been seeing these last few years. But still, I mean, I think we need more time now before like sorting like everything out. But generally speaking, when it comes to applying CBDCs or combining the idea of a CBDC and Forex, I think that generally speaking, this instant payment facility, or almost instant by CBDCs, is actually going to serve to reduce settlement risks, generally speaking. No, I mean, it could propagate a much more effective distribution of central bank liquidity, like globally, and therefore reducing risks. I think that's the idea. No, I mean, actually, according to some stats, it may bring down like the annual expenses related to Forex by 130 billion. No, so generally speaking, I mean, one of the problems when it comes to Forex is precisely that that long time lapse between trading and settlement. So in that sense, CBDCs might be helpful. But however, it's what Musheer said before. No? I mean, how that's going to be integrated, how the technology is going to work, this is like a work in progress. No? So that's why, well, I mean, it's difficult to jump to any conclusion right now. It's way too early. But to me, I think that CBDCs might be beneficial in that Forex area, like generally speaking.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about it's interesting when you say it's still a long way ago. It's like 7 to 10 years. Wow. I mean, I think before, when we were talking about significant changes, we're talking about a couple of decades at least, and now the time has significantly accelerated when we consider long term or a long way away. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I think the first one, sort of, we touched upon it in the previous question when well, the question says, will Chinese yuan impact WeChat payment transactions somehow? If so, how? I think you sort of, Musheer, you mentioned something around WeChat in your prior answer and said about integration. Anything else that you would like to add to this point, or Oriol as well afterwards?
Right. So as we mentioned, right, that it's not only the banks who need to be worried about disintermediation, but also payment players to a certain extent, right? If a large amount of the pure role of a payment player like an Alipay or WeChat Pay, the fundamental role is to facilitate payments between two individuals or businesses, right? An individual business. So they don't own the bank, they don't own the issuance, they're just a conduit or intermediary, right? So if a central bank is going to allow transactions to take place, you don't necessarily need a wallet, right? As you will not need a bank account. Having said that, I think a lot of central banks aren't going to disintermediate. In fact, when it comes to mainland China, and this was announced earlier in one of these regulatory conferences, both Alipay and WeChat Pay have been working with the PBOC on the trials, etc., for the digital yuan, right? And what will likely happen is, and this is also for the other banks, the PBOC will use these players, which are regulated entities, for transmission or for distribution of the digital yuan, because they already hold all these, Ant and WeChat have over 700, 800 million active users, right, on a monthly basis. So it's a lot easier for a distribution model than having people sign up to the central bank's wallet. So I actually expect that this will be complementary and it will be just a switch. But the whole point there being, if the central bank wanted, they could choose not to. But at the end, what are all these banks? What are all these payment players? They're all regulated, licensed entities because the central bank wants intermediaries in there, right? So I don't see that changing. And I feel that they'll just be seamlessly integrated into the overall system for the retail side of the CBDC. On the wholesale side, in any case, WeChat, etc., aren't used so much for international wholesale. Maybe a little bit on the domestic wholesale. That may be a little bit of concern, but on the retail side, consumer side, I don't see that having too much of an impact.
Perfect. I think on the interest of time, is it okay if we go to the next question, and Oriol, maybe you can help us with your views. And the question is, do you think the emergence of CBDC will support the development of other more traditional or cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, etc., or will the emergence of CBDC will likely shrink the use and adoption of the of the other?
Well, actually, this is a question that many people ask, and it's a very common one, but actually, it's a very interesting one. No, I think that, as I said before, CBDCs are not the same as cryptocurrencies because they respond to different realities. This means that it doesn't necessarily mean that just because a country, let's say, promotes a CBDC, this country is going to encourage or discourage the use of cryptocurrencies. I mean, those are like two different realities. We saw China, for example. China is adopting this crackdown on cryptocurrencies. They started to adopt this crackdown on 2017, but it's been like intensified lately because of environmental reasons, such as the energy used by Bitcoin mining, etc. So we can see, for example, a country like China like adopting like a tough stance towards cryptocurrencies, whilst at the same time like trying to promote its central bank digital currency, digital yuan. It's possible as well to see a country like testing and potentially deploying in the future its own CBDC while being much more crypto friendly. So both respond to different realities to some extent. So I don't think, I mean, some people do, I mean, that's respectable. Personally, I don't think that just because CBDCs are much more widely adopted in a country, this is going to imply that people will use like cryptocurrencies much more often, or the opposite. No, I think those are not related, because actually the profile of people like using both, I think it's going to be different. I mean, CBDCs are nothing else, as we said, but central bank money at the end of the day. So they're going to be like widely used by everyone. Whereas cryptocurrencies, I don't think that they are going to be so widely used like for everyone, given its volatility. They might be like mainstream, no? They might be like widely used, but not to the same extent, I think. So I think it's going to be used like for different purposes, sometimes even by different people. So this is why I don't think that the emergence of one needs to imply like the emergence of the other or the opposite. No?
Sorry, I wasn't me. Thank you very much. We have another question. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, here you appear again. What competition would stable coins present to CBDCs? Following Gresham's law, bad money drives out good. Would stable coins be the bad money or vice versa? Really interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. I think so first, for those of you who don't know what stable coins are nothing but these interoperable tokens that are pegged to a certain currency, right? So there's the world's most famous stable coin is a stable coin known as Tether, Tether, which is pegged to the US dollar. What the issuers say is for every Tether that is issued, they have a US dollar in deposit put in escrow, right? So that, and the treasury. So whenever you're transacting using Tether, you are effectively transacting $1 US. So the value of the stablecoin more or less remains at $1 plus or minus 1% for some reason, right? So that's typically the case when the main culprit with stablecoin comes down to the audit, and if whether these stablecoin issuing companies have the amount of money that they say they have for the amount of stablecoins they've issued. So if they've issued $2 billion of US dollar USDTC, which is the Tether stablecoin, whether there is $2 billion of actual US dollars in the escrow, right, or in the treasury, as it were. So confirming that is a very important element, and that's where it gets a little tricky. I don't think necessarily that stablecoins are a competition for CBDCs. I think they're actually enablers for CBDCs. As I mentioned, interoperability is going to be a bit of an issue. So CBDCs end up, stablecoins end up being that route that enable people to transact in the distributed ledger technology or the blockchain world without having to, be too concerned about having cryptocurrency ownership, right? For example, you may be able to convert your US dollar into USDT and then use the USDT for transacting on exchanges, which you could not say go and buy cryptocurrencies on many exchanges from using your own fiat currency. So that's another major issue. So for me, it's going to be more of an enabler. Yes, the bad actors are going to play a role, but I do see some stable coins that will come out of more reputable institutions. Libra is one of those that was supposed to be a multi-currency stable coin, but now Libra, which is now being coined as DM. So Facebook is one of the major persons behind DM are looking at issuing US dollar stable coins, which is probably going to be more reliable considering it's over $1 trillion company that is issuing it with $2 billion users. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Oriol, anything that you would like to add?
No, I mean, basically, regarding this last question, I completely agree with Musheer, and just something about that one on WeChat Pay and Alipay. I just wanted to add, that when China started to test the digital yuan last year, actually many people wondered whether China's intention in the end would be like to replace, those private payment platforms or to like cooperate with them. And we saw that, as Musheer said before, we saw that China is going to choose the second option, because actually I think it's all about interoperability, in the same way that even though, as Musheer said before, it's going to be possible for central banks to follow this like one-tiered structure, where central banks could like issue the CBDC directly to the public at large. I mean, this is of course possible. I think that based on what we are seeing in most tests and POCs, most central banks are actually going to follow this two-tiered model, where actually fintech firms and commercial banks will still play a role, this role of distributing the CBDC to the general public. So it's going to be like this two-tier structure where the central bank is going to issue the CBDC to the commercial banks / fintech firms, and those are going to issue the CBDC to the public at large. So this is just one more example of how many like possibilities CBDCs offer. Because as we said before, I mean, they are programmable. And like technology-wise, there are so many possible things to do with them that it makes it difficult now to say that CBDCs are this or that, because there are so many options that it's quite tricky actually now to try to narrow everything down to a like single category.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think we don't have, let me just double check. I think those are all the questions that we have from the audience. Thank you very much. Conscious of time, the time has gone really, really fast. I think there are many more things that we could discuss. I think a never-ending topic, and definitely one that continues to evolve and to shape the future of economies, companies, and the way that we actually even think about the exchange of value and money and transactions around the world. So thank you very much for your time. It was very interesting. Thank you for the attendees and your questions. Jose, I think back to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you again. In the name of the Mexican Chamber of Commerce and the Mexican community in Hong Kong, we would like to thank you. Thank you, Carolina, for leading this conversation. Thank you, Musheer and Oriol, for being part of this very interesting conversation. And I think we open up the forum to follow. I think these great leaders in the digital currency and the fintech. In the fintech part of Hong Kong, or ecosystem of Hong Kong and of the world. So please feel free, I guess, to reach out to them directly through their LinkedIn and their public profiles, because definitely they have a lot of very interesting things to share. They're constantly adding more information. They're constantly updating, because as we shared at the beginning, this is a topic that needs constant feed and needs constant information. So again, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate everyone for being here. And just to remind, be part of the Mexican community, be part of this Mexican Chamber of Commerce. We are constantly doing different topics, so follow up us in social media. And yeah, do let us know if there's any specific topics that you would like us to touch upon. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you in the next event.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.